Look at the geopolitical board right now. The Middle East is physically burning. We're watching kinetic strikes actively degrade the foundational oil infrastructure of the globe. And the mainstream reaction is to simply panic about the price at the pump for the next quarter. They treat a burning refinery as a temporary inconvenience. For the last decade, policymakers and venture capital have sold us a hallucination. They convinced the public that we are entering a weightless, post-carbon economy. The prevailing narrative is that print enough money for battery plants, scale enough wind turbines, and wait for the nuclear renaissance, we can permanently decouple modern civilization from fossil fuels. But the physical reality is that you cannot build a green energy grid. You cannot forge the infrastructure for the future. And you cannot fight a modern war without the extreme thermal density of the carbon molecule. Even in the middle of a multi-trillion-dollar green revolution, oil is not a legacy asset. It is the inescapable bridge and the permanent physical choke point of civilization. Welcome to Growth. I'm Sean, your guide to money and navigating the frontier of innovation. Today, we'll break down the chemistry of why all oil is not created equal, why the American shale boom is a massive CapEx treadmill, and why the most urgent investable alpha over the next decade is flowing directly back to the heavy industrial baseload. Let's start from scratch. What exactly is oil? At its absolute baseline, oil is a liquid concentration of ancient solar energy. It is a complex distribution of molecules called hydrocarbons, forged by the Earth over millions of years. A hydrocarbon is exactly what it sounds like, a chain of carbon atoms locked to hydrogen atoms. When biological matter died and was buried many years ago, the Earth crushed it under extreme subterranean pressure and heat. That violent physical process forged a covalent bond between carbon and hydrogen. That bond is the ultimate molecular battery. When you break it inside an industrial turbine or a combustion engine, you release an astonishing amount of kinetic energy. And because that kinetic energy is the baseline of modern civilization, the financial system tries to simplify it. That is exactly what an oil index is designed to do. Flatten the chemistry into a clean, tradable number. Many investors open their terminal, look at the ticker for WTI or Brent crude, and assume a barrel of oil is just a uniform unit of energy. It is not. Those tickers are not just financial instruments. They are geographical coordinates. WTI is West Texas Intermediate. Brent is pulled from the cold waters of the North Sea. And in the physical world, geography fundamentally dictates the chemistry of oil. Depending on the exact subterranean pressure and the millions of years of heat in that specific geographic region, the oil comes out of the ground at completely different points on the hydrocarbon distribution. Let's look at the United States. The oil refractor out of the shale in the Permian Basin is classified as light and sweet. In physics terms, these are short, simple hydrocarbon chains. They have a high API gravity, meaning they have low density and flow almost like water. And sweet means the crude has extremely low sulfur content. Because the molecules are so light, when you hit these crude in a distillation column, it naturally flashes off into lightweight products, primarily gasoline for consumer cars and naphtha for basic petrochemicals. It is thermodynamically easy to process. It is the fast food of global energy. But the heavy industrial economy does not run on fast food. Look at the oil that comes out of the Orinoco Belt in Venezuela, the tar sands of Canada, or the massive Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia. That crude is skewed toward heavy and sour. Structurally, these are massive, dense macromolecular chains, heavy resins and asphaltenes. It doesn't flow naturally. It is highly viscous, thick, like molasses. You often have to inject extreme heat and steam into the pipeline just to get it to move. And sour means it is loaded with sulfur. If you don't aggressively scrub the sulfur out using complex chemical processing, it turns into sulfuric acid. It'll literally eat through the carbon steel piping of a standard facility. But the critical macroeconomic reality is that heavy, sour crude is the physical muscle of civilization. When you put heavy crude through a complex, high-pressure cracking process, it yields the heavy distillates. It gives you the diesel required to run the global trucking fleet. It gives you the bunker fuel that powers maritime shipping. It gives you aviation fuel and the heavy chemical feedstocks absolutely required to manufacture advanced plastics, industrial fertilizers, and the very asphalt that paves the supply chain. You cannot run a global industrial base purely on light, sweet shale oil. You need the heavy molecules. And this chemical mismatch creates a massive physical infrastructure bottleneck inside the United States. A refinery is not a flexible black box. It is a multi-billion-dollar chemistry set. It is engineered and structurally locked to a specific crude. During the 1990s and early 2000s, the US spent hundreds of billions of dollars upgrading its massive refineries on the Texas Gulf Coast. They installed complex cokers and hydrocrackers specifically designed to boil, crack, and strip the sulfur out of heavy, sour crude imported from the Middle East and Venezuela. You cannot suddenly feed light, sweet West Texas shale oil into a complex refinery built for heavy sludge. The chemistry fails, the distillation columns overheat, and the multi-billion-dollar heavy cracking equipment sits idle, destroying the facility's profit margins. This exposes the biggest geopolitical illusion of the last decade of American energy independence. Politicians claim we're independent because the sheer volume of shale oil we pump out of the ground matches the volume we consume. But they are completely ignoring the physics of the extraction, let alone the refinery. Look at a traditional, conventional oil field in the Middle East. It is essentially a massive, highly permeable subterranean sponge trapped under immense natural pressure. You drill a single hole, and Thermodynamics does the work. That well can produce millions of barrels reliably for 50 years with minimal capital expenditure. A US shale well operates on a completely different paradigm. The oil is trapped inside dense, impermeable rock. You have to blast millions of gallons of water, chemicals, and send high pressure into the ground just to shatter the substrate and force the molecules out. But the moment you shatter that rock, the biological clock starts. The pressure drops violently. A typical Permian shale well depletes by up to 60% in its first 24 months. You have to run faster and faster just to stay in the exact same place. Shale is not a permanent structural advantage. It is a massive CapEx treadmill. US drillers have to constantly pour billions of dollars of fresh capitals into the ground, drilling and fracking hundreds of new wells every single month, just to offset the rapid geological decay of the wells they drilled last year. They're spending billions just to keep the overall production line flat. And the data shows the treadmill is reaching its physical limit. The US Energy Information Administration projects that American oil production, driven almost entirely by the Permian Basin, will hit its absolute peak between 2027 and 2028. You cannot engineer your way out of a depleted rock formation. When that peak hits and the CapEx treadmill stops, the global market will violently snap right back to relying on the heavy, conventional barrels of the Middle East. So, if oil is a geopolitical trap, why haven't we just engineered our way out of it? Why hasn't the Green Revolution replaced it? Because of energy density. Nature spent hundreds of millions of years compressing biological matter under extreme subterranean pressure to forge the covalent hydrocarbon bond. It is the ultimate molecular battery. It is hyperdense, instantly dispatchable, and highly stable to transport across an ocean. The green energy transition assumes we can replace this compressed chemical energy with solar and wind. But the physics of solar and wind are fundamentally diffuse and intermittent. You only get power when the weather cooperates. To match the continuous 24/7 reliability of a hydrocarbon, you're forced to build massive, incredibly expensive lithium-ion battery farms just to buffer the grid. The CapEx requirements destroy the economic model. And what about the nuclear renaissance? If you watched our previous deep dive on nuclear fission, you know exactly where I stand. In terms of actual deployable infrastructure, nuclear fission is the most energy-dense commercial process on Earth. And the tech monopolies know it is the only permanent baseload solution to power the age of AI. But capital does not live in the year 2040. Capital has to survive the present. In the physical world today, traditional nuclear is a regulatory and CapEx trap. It takes over a decade and $20 billion just to permit and build a single conventional reactor in the West. And while the small modular reactor, the SMR, will eventually revolutionize the grid by turning power plants from custom civil engineering project into factory-built products, that fleet is not plugging into the global infrastructure tomorrow. We're staring directly into a massive 10 to 15-year temporal gap. It is a physical chasm between the structural failure of intermittent renewables and the arrival of the commercial nuclear fleet. You cannot scale a global digital economy while waiting 15 years for a permit. So what bridges that chasm? What keeps the data centers running and the heavy industrial supply chain from collapsing right now? The hydrocarbon. For the next decade, oil and natural gas are not optional. They are the only viable, energy-dense bridge capable of keeping modern civilization online until the atomic revolution reaches scale. But the fatal flaw in the end of oil narrative isn't just about how we generate electricity. The trap is versatility. Let's run a thought experiment. Let's say policymakers ban every single combustion engine on Earth tomorrow. Every car is an EV. Have we solved the oil problem? No, because oil is not just a combustion fuel. It is the physical substrate of modern civilization. Look at the green energy infrastructure itself. You literally cannot build a wind turbine without petroleum. The massive fiberglass blades are manufactured using epoxy resins derived directly from the hydrocarbon chain. The gearbox inside the turbine requires hundreds of gallons of specialized petroleum lubricants to keep the steel from tearing itself apart. Jet fuel for global aviation, the heavy bunker fuel that powers maritime shipping, the medical plastics used in every hospital on Earth. You cannot build a modern civilization without the carbon molecule. But Silicon Valley doesn't want to talk about the physical world. They want you to look at artificial intelligence and see a weightless, pristine digital brain. They are selling you an illusion. A gigawatt data center is not a cloud. It is a heavy industrial complex physically tethered to the petroleum supply chain. Let's start with the materials. The thousands of miles of high voltage cabling required to wire a single gigawatt campus are wrapped in XLPE and PVC insulation, direct derivatives of the petrochemical cracking process. The advanced dielectric fluids required for liquid immersion cooling, synthetic hydrocarbons. Then look at the hardware. You cannot physically transport a $50,000 NVIDIA GPU from a semiconductor fab in Taiwan to a server rack in Texas without the heavy bunker fuel of maritime shipping and the jet fuel of global aviation. And finally, the power. An AI training run cannot afford a single millisecond of grid latency. To guarantee that uptime, hyperscalers are forced to build massive, zero-fail backup power plants on site. What do those backup plants run on? They don't run on solar. They run on millions of gallons of refined, heavy diesel fuel sitting in physical storage tank right outside the building. The green transition, the AI revolution, and the physical expansion of the modern grid are not decoupled from the barrel. They are permanently tethered to the extreme thermal density and chemical versatility of heavy crude. Let's step back. What is the bigger picture here? Right now, retail traders are beating up oil futures, treating this like a standard, temporary geopolitical risk premium. They assume the math goes back to normal the second a ceasefire is signed. That is the fundamental mispricing of reality. They're ignoring the physical damage already made. This isn't just a naval standoff in the Strait of Hormuz anymore. We're watching kinetic strikes actively degrade the foundational oil facilities of core producing nations. The war is accelerating, and the infrastructure is physically burning. A kinetic war in the Middle East isn't just a 6-month oil trade. It is the catalyst that exposes the physical choke point of the global digital economy. Right now, Google, Meta, and Microsoft are hoarding hundreds of billions of dollars worth of NVIDIA GPUs. They treat these chips like digital gold. But a $50,000 GPU is a stranded asset if the global energy supply chain fractures. You cannot run a gigawatt data center if the heavy chemical feedstocks required to build and cool it are burning in a war zone. Capital is ruthless. It eventually realizes when a system is mispriced. When the market prices in the physical reality of a rapidly accelerating regional war with permanently degraded infrastructure, we will witness a violent value migration. The tech monopolies have the cash, but the heavy industrial fortresses outside the blast radius have the molecules. Look at the North American pipeline operators, the complex Gulf Coast refineries, the entities that control the secure domestic flow of heavy crude. These were treated as boring, low-margin legacy assets, but in a fractured geopolitical board, they suddenly dictate the terms. They hold the ultimate pricing power because without their physical baseload and their chemical feedstocks, the trillion-dollar digital cloud cannot operate, cool itself, or physically survive. But that immense domestic leverage is entirely dependent on a foreign supply chain. Politicians hid behind the spreadsheet. They pointed to the sheer volume of Permian shale and claimed American energy independence, intentionally ignoring the fact that our heavy industrial refineries are physically addicted to imported heavy crude. But when that CapEx treadmill in the Permian officially hits its peak between 2027 and 2028, even the spreadsheet math collapses. The final paper illusion of Western self-reliance will shatter. And the intelligence agencies of the world already know this. Artificial intelligence is no longer just a commercial software product. It is a sovereign kinetic weapon. If you are a sovereign nation, you cannot rely on intermittent weather patterns to power your national defense. Sovereign AI requires sovereign baseload power. And for the next 10 to 15 years, that power is structurally locked to the hydrocarbon molecule. For the last decade, we lived in a zero interest rate hallucination. We rewarded companies that built digital abstractions, and we punished the companies that pulled heavy physical matter out of the ground. We told ourselves we were entering a post-carbon, weightless future. But thermodynamic reality never cared about our PR statements. The entities that own the molecules, the pipelines, and the turbines will not be left behind by the digital revolution. They're going to hold the digital economy hostage. So here's the real question for you. You can print trillions of dollars for the green transition, and you can write millions of lines of code for the AI revolution. But if you cannot forge the steel, crack the plastics, or physically cool the data centers without the hydrocarbon, how long until the market realizes that oil isn't a legacy asset, but the permanent choke point of the future? Let me know your take in the comments below. This was Sean from BySpark. If you enjoyed the video, press like, subscribe, and don't forget the notification. And if you want a deep dive report with the full citations and market breakdown, subscribe to our newsletter at the link below. Thank you for watching. Until next time.